This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Jill Newbron at tonight's top stories from East Asia. Japan and South Korea taking more steps to ease an energy supply crunch from the blockade of Hormuz. Seoul pushes a $17 billion extra budget, while Tokyo mulls support for nations able to provide alternative supplies. Japan's agreement with Indonesia highlighting that potential directive, the two nations stepping up coordination on energy security in talks between the leaders in Tokyo. China and Pakistan vowing to strengthen cooperation on Iran as Islamabad emerges as a key broker in potential ceasefire talks. Beijing welcoming the first visit by EU lawmakers in 8 years as China seeks to stabilize relations with the bloc following the lifting of retaliatory sanctions last year. Also tonight, warming seas in the Arctic, opening new shipping lanes to vast natural resources, potentially sparking a race for influence in the high north between the US, China and Russia. South Korea is planning to spend $17.3 billion to mitigate against the economic fallout of the war in Iran. The proposed supplementary budget was announced after President Lee Jae-myung called for bold measures to address energy concerns. Mr. Lee hinting as well that an emergency economic decree could be enacted if needed. Well, for more, CNA senior correspondent Lee Myung-suk joins us live from Seoul. First of all, Young-suk, tell us more about this proposed budget.
Well, the proposed supplementary budget, according to the government, is aimed to help the people here deal with this rising energy costs here, since South Korea relies heavily on imported energy, and so it quickly pushes up living costs here too. And I think a lot of South Koreans here are starting to feel the impact. So before I talk about the details, if I can tell you right now here in South Korea, South Koreans are worried that there's going to be a shortage of garbage plastic bags, special ones that you need to throw out garbage, because these are made from oil-based materials. In fact, in some areas, South Koreans were even panic buying these garbage disposal bags last week and even this week, forcing the South Korea's Environment Minister, Kim Sung-hwan, to come forward, assuring the South Korean public that they didn't have to worry about the garbage bag shortage. And if needed, in a worst-case scenario, the government would allow regular plastic bags to be used. And so as South Koreans are feeling this impact, the South Korean government says that it has to come forward, and that's why it came out with the supplementary budget, stepping in with two main ideas. And, one of them is the government is planning to use about 10 trillion won, that's about 40% of the total proposed budget, to ease the burden of high oil prices. A key part of that is going to be used on the price cap on fuel so that you can stop petrol and diesel prices from rising too much. Also, direct support is planned to be given to South Korean people. And the government says that it plans to give cash-like vouchers to about 70% of the population. And that's between, about $75 to $450 per person, depending on their income and where you live. Now, the aim of this is to help people cope with higher costs and hopefully keep the spending going. There's also going to be extra help for groups most likely hit hardest, like giving fuel subsidies to farmers and fishermen, as well as small-scale cargo ship operators. Also, a portion of those funds will be going to local governments so that they can respond to problems in their own areas. Now, President Lee Jae-myung is expected to address the National Assembly on Thursday to talk about this supplementary budget and hopefully get the parliament to pass this as soon as possible.
Yeah, the thing is, Young-suk, that's not all. In fact, the government's doing more to address the energy crisis, isn't it?
Well, yes. The South Korean government isn't relying on just that one solution. So it is taking different steps to manage this energy crunch. First, there is this crude oil swap system where companies here are securing oil now and saying that they will settle the payment later. So far, about 4 South Korean companies have signed up, covering about 20 million barrels, which should be delivered by the end of June. Now, experts here are saying that could help keep the supply steady, at least in the short term. Apart from that, the South Korean government is also looking for ways to reduce demand, since South Korea imports most of its oil. Now, there is this driving restriction for South Korean government employees, where employees can't bring all their cars out every day. But the South Korean government is saying that this could be expanded nationwide if oil prices keep rising, though it does say that would be the last resort. Also, the South Korean companies are trying to find different ways to bring in energy. For example, LG Chem imported naphtha from Russia after the U.S. gave a temporary waiver. And experts are saying that South Korea is important to secure enough oil, use less if needed, and also stay flexible on sourcing.
All right, CNA's Im Young-suk reporting live from Seoul. Now, that was South Korea, but Japan also preparing to take further action to address the fallout from the war in Iran. Its economy and health ministries have set up a task force to secure medical supplies. The nation's hospitals are heavily reliant on imported petrochemical products to produce basic provisions, including naphtha and ethylene used for surgery and dialysis. But the effective halt of passage through the Strait of Hormuz has been raising worries about medical supplies. Japan's economy minister has said the government is not anticipating an immediate interruption, but is working to procure products from alternative sources. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi announcing the task force's formation at a cabinet-level meeting on the situation in the Middle East. She emphasized her commitment, saying that Japan must not run short of medical supplies. Ms. Takaichi also noting that she will consider giving support for nations that provide Japan with those vital goods. Japan and Indonesia have agreed to step up coordination on energy security after their leaders met in Tokyo during President Prabowo Subianto's first state visit to Japan. The energy crisis linked to the conflict involving Iran was a very key focus. Now, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi says the war has highlighted the global importance of resources and energy security. CNA's Chatni Babani reports.
Against the backdrop of global energy concerns and the Middle East conflict, Japan and Indonesia have agreed to enhance cooperation, particularly in energy security.
地域国際情勢に関しては、イランをはじめとする中東情勢のほか、南シナ海、核ミサイル問題および拉致問題を含む北朝鮮への対応についても意見交換をしました。特に中東情勢については、エネルギー安全保障の観点からも両国で緊密に連携していくことを確認しました。
While no details were provided regarding the coordination mechanism, it is worth noting that Indonesia is the world's largest exporter of thermal coal for power generation, supplying approximately half of global exports. Indonesia is also a major LNG exporter, with about a quarter of its shipments going to Japan. Now, standing alongside Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi described Indonesia as a major resource-rich nation. President Prabowo said the two countries would make their best efforts to convince all parties to de-escalate the conflict.
Di tengah dunia yang penuh tantangan, penuh ketidakpastian, bahkan penuh bahaya, kami sepakat bahwa baik Jepang dan Indonesia akan berusaha keras untuk meyakinkan semua pihak untuk melakukan deeskalasi.
The president added that amid complex geopolitical dynamics, Indonesia and Japan must be part of the solution and contribute to stability. Now, both leaders emphasized the importance of working together to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific. Indonesia said it will work to accelerate the ratification and implementation of the amended protocol to the Indonesia-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and welcomed Japan's participation and partnerships in sectors such as the economy, critical minerals and rare earths, and renewables. Chandni Vatwani, CNA, Jakarta.
Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar is in Beijing for talks with China. As the Iran war drags into a fifth week, no clear end in sight. Beijing said both sides have agreed to step up coordination as they push for US-Iran talks to stabilize markets and ease pressure on oil prices. Islamabad is positioning itself as a mediator, citing ties with both Washington and Tehran. Over the weekend, Pakistan hosted regional foreign ministers, with Dar saying talks could take place within days. China has backed the push for a ceasefire, but signals from President Donald Trump are mixed, with Washington hinting at both diplomacy and possible escalation. Coming up on East Asia tonight, South Korea's aviation sector feeling the strain as the Middle East conflict sends fuel costs soaring, with jet fuel prices doubling in weeks. As the conflict's economic fallout spreads beyond the Gulf, we look at who stands to gain. Welcome back, everyone. Roland Lim joins us with the business news, and it's another difficult day on the markets, Roland.
I'm afraid so, yes. The bigger question is whether this is just a risk of pause or it is the start of a deeper sell-off. Now, traders are quickly trying to reprice inflation and policy in the markets. Asia-Pacific markets mostly under more pressure as worries climb over prolonged conflict in the Middle East. But Asian stocks have now wiped out gains for the year as traders avoid risky bets. The MSCI Asia-Pacific Index is down 0.3% so far this year. That's a big shift from the stellar gains the region logged at the start of the year, supported by AI-driven gains. The core inflation in Tokyo stayed below the central bank's target for a second straight month in March. Fuel subsidies offset the rising costs from a weak yen. But this is said to be temporary as high oil prices from the Middle East war threatens to boost inflation. Oil prices swinging between a 2% rise and a 1% fall. Brent crude at this hour up by 1.86%, $114.88 a barrel. The West Texas Intermediate is staying above that key $100 mark. Now, traders are bracing for an escalation of military hostilities after the Trump administration requested an additional $200 billion in funding for the war. The White House also said the president was considering asking Arab nations to pay for the cost of the conflict. Earlier, my colleague Henry Yin spoke to the founder and president of Rapid Energy Group. Now, he explained why investors could be underestimating the risk of a more severe oil supply shock ahead.
We went into this crisis with most people believing it would be impossible for anyone to block Hormuz for more than a couple of days. The U.S. certainly wouldn't allow that. And there was a lot of hope that it would somehow end quickly as it dragged on if President Trump just declared a ceasefire or sort of walked away. But I think that hope is now starting to fade. And I think a more pragmatic and sober view is coming into the markets. We also had buffers, Henry. We had oil on the water. We had a release of strategic stocks. There was still oil that had gotten out before the conflict from the Gulf headed to Asia. But all of those temporary buffers are pretty much gone now. And now comes the pain. You're certainly seeing that in Asia, in Singapore and other Asian countries with shortages. And so I think now it's going to be harder to ignore that this is quite a serious crisis.
Not only oil, we're also seeing spillover effects into other sectors like fertilizers, metals, and broader input costs. So how serious is the risk that this feeds into inflation expectations and ties the Fed's hands?
Well, it is quite serious macroeconomic risk. As you mentioned, it affects manufacturing, chips, agriculture, in addition to energy. And so we've seen it in the past, many recessions, inflations and then recessions. Since the Second World War, there was usually an oil price spike at the scene of the crime, if you will. And so it's a serious risk. Now then, much depends on how central banks react, how fiscal authorities react. That can exacerbate or mitigate any inflationary consequences. But as an oil analyst, I can tell you the oil price will continue to rise to whatever levels necessary to enforce the iron law of economics, which says you cannot consume what you cannot produce. And if we can't start producing that 20% of energy that we've lost, we're going to have to consume less. And that's going to come through slower economic growth.
China's factory activity expanded for the first time this year, despite higher energy prices and disruptions caused by the escalating conflict in the Middle East. The official Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI, rose to 50.4 in March from 49 a month earlier. Remember, reading above 50 indicates expansion in the manufacturing sector. On the services side, non-manufacturing PMI also nudged higher. Both indicators came in better than analysts' forecasts. Checking in on the Chinese markets, positive manufacturing data failing to offset investor caution over the Mid-East conflict. The mainland indices ending the day lower. Shanghai Composite down 0.8%. Second bourse, the Shenzhen was off because it's tech-laden. It's down by 1.81%. Meantime, though, the Hang Seng Index managing to edge up just a touch, 0.2% at the close. Amid the global sell-off, though, Chinese equities are seen as relatively resilient. Now, they're holding up better than global peers as high oil prices hit energy importing economies. So far this month, major Asian markets, South Korea, Japan, India, down more than 10%. Meanwhile, Chinese indices down by around 5 to 6%, despite being the world's largest oil importer. Meantime, China appears to be turning back to U.S. energy imports as global supply concerns intensify, according to data from energy analytics firm Kepler. Now, that's amid turmoil in global energy markets triggered by Iran's effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly 600,000 barrels per day of U.S. crude are set to be shipped to China in April, with additional LNG cargoes scheduled this month. If delivered, this would be the first shipment since early 2025. Now, China had stopped buying U.S. crude and gas after Washington imposed tariffs after Donald Trump took office. In 2024, China's crude oil imports from the U.S. amounted to about $6 billion, which made up 1.8% of its total oil imports. Now, China, the world's largest crude importer, relies on foreign sources for about 70% of its oil. Analysts say Beijing could also use increased energy purchases as leverage in upcoming trade talks with the U.S., with a summit expected in May. China also working on cooperating with Russia on energy, with President Vladimir Putin expected to visit China as early as May. Projects on the table include a gas pipeline from Russia to China. South Korea's flag carrier Korean Air will reportedly enter emergency management next month due to rising cost pressures from surging fuel prices. Korean Air says it expects fuel prices to more than double next month, significantly disrupting its business targets. Now, ticket prices from its Incheon hub to New York and Chicago have more than tripled for the coming months, while fares to London and Paris are projected to surge by up to 250%. Local media say fellow South Korean carriers Asiana and T-Way have already entered into emergency management mode. The share is losing altitude across the board. Korean Air down by more than 3%. Asiana managing to pare off those losses, closing flat, while budget carrier T-Way plunging more than a fifth. Now, last week, the country's three largest low-cost carriers said that they were planning to cut some services to Southeast Asia.
So as the conflict escalates, who benefits may matter as much as the cost. A blunt question: who profits from the Middle East war? And are we now seeing also serious questions being raised about whether some people tried to make money before military action even began? Well, Roland joining me once more to explain all this. Roland, that introduction just really brings a sharper political and ethical angle to the story now, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, the broader answer to that, who profits, really, it's the usual suspects. It is your energy producers, it's your energy traders, it's your war risk insurers, and also some defense companies. But the story has now gone beyond this. The Financial Times reporting today that a broker for U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had made a large investment, or wanted to make a large investment, into a defense-focused BlackRock ETF just before the Iran attack. Now, the trade ultimately didn't go through, and of course the Pentagon has absolutely denied the allegations, but it does add to the wideness scrutiny, really, of, as you alluded to, that people in close to power or in power might be trying to benefit with the war coming up.
Yeah, and now even federal prosecutors also looking into whether prediction market bets are in breach of insider trading laws.
Yeah, there are huge question marks over whether people with advanced knowledge or people who are close to decision makers, that they might be making these controversial bets. Why I say controversial? Because these bets are essentially gambling. I mean, the prediction markets is really, you can basically bet on anything. For example, most people bet on sports results, or you could even bet on, say, how many tweets Elon Musk is going to make on X this week. So Reuters is reporting that there's going to be now intense scrutiny, federal scrutiny, over these well-timed bets just before the Trump administration made its moves. And at the same time, experts are also calling for closer scrutiny, especially on these trades in the commodities and the predictions market.
Now, I want to go back to that question that we asked right in the beginning on profits. Who benefits? So the most obvious suspects are oil and gas producers, but what are we not seeing here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the clearest winners are, of course, the oil and gas producers. I mean, Strait of Hormuz is now restricted. It handled 20% of total oil production, or oil coming out of the region. It also handled about 20% of LNG. So once you disrupt that, I mean, prices are going to rise pretty fast. At the start of the war, oil prices went up 15%. It's currently about $120. That's the most extreme we've seen. And that's still, right now, we're talking about 50% above the levels we saw before the war in the Middle East. So obviously producers benefit, but I should also mention that energy traders benefit. French giant Total Energies made a killing. Bad word to use, of course, but they made a killing in the physical market simply because they dominated the physical space in the Middle East. So it doesn't matter just about who owns the oil in the ground, but also for companies that actually have the trading networks, they have the ships, they have the storage space, they have the contracts and the market intelligence to actually exploit the price gaps.
All right, so if the war prolongs, right, and we still have a key shipping choke point, take us down the chain as to who else gains.
Right. Shippers, war insurance, shippers, insurers, they gain. We've seen usually risk premiums for vessels that carry value is at 0.2% of that value of that cargo. So say, for example, $1 million or $100 million cargo of oil, so it's 2% of that, right? Now, or 0.2% of that, I should say. Now it's actually 1%. So you're talking about a 5-fold increase in war premiums just on cargo alone. So we're going to see that. And it's really a kind of a global surcharge. And, you know, that keeps the cargo moving through the Strait of Hormuz. But that extra costs that the exporters are paying for that cargo, that's going to get passed on to the consumer at some point in time. So we're talking about energy, food, fertilizers, these things that are actually also petrochemical reliant on. These will affect the supply chains further down the road.
So it is a military war to start. So what about when it comes to defense contractors, for example? We would assume that they would also be somewhat the winners out there.
Yeah, strategically, I mean, they are the longer-term beneficiaries, but the markets don't always move so neatly. During the first days of the war, we actually saw European defense stocks actually come down. Well, why it was coming down, it wasn't because business was bad, but because traders were just simply too busy trying to raise cash. So there was a very crowded trade. So I think people who want to bet on stocks that would benefit from this war need to be a little bit careful and realize that actually the stocks don't move in a way, or might not move in a way that they think it should.
All right. Well, we have to leave it there. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Roland Lim, speaking to us there. Coming up on East Asia tonight, EU lawmakers make their first official visit to China in 8 years amid thawing relations from the lifting of retaliatory sanctions. And an historic move by Japan in its deployment of advanced weaponry. You're with East Asia tonight. These are the headlines we're following. Japan and South Korea taking more steps to ease an energy supply crunch from the blockade in Hormuz. Seoul pushes a $17 billion extra budget, while Tokyo mulls support for nations able to provide alternative supplies. Japan further hedging against the oil and gas disruption, agreeing to step up coordination on energy security with Indonesia after a meeting between the leaders of both nations. And Beijing hosting EU lawmakers for the first time in 8 years as China seeks to stabilize relations with the bloc following the lifting of retaliatory sanctions. Well, let's stay on that topic. And for more, CNA senior correspondent Tan Yuguan joining us live from Shanghai. Yuguan, the EU delegation visit is suggesting a softer stance towards China. But how hard was it for China to get to this point? And what does it want to achieve?
Well, it took quite a bit to get here. This is the first European parliamentary delegation to visit China in 8 years. And that is significant because ties did not just cool, they broke down first because of the pandemic. Then more seriously in 2021, that was when the EU, if you recall, sanctioned Chinese officials over Xinjiang. Those sanctions were over alleged human rights abuses against Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in China's far west. The EU then cited mass detention, surveillance, and forced labor concerns. Beijing has rejected those accusations and then hit back with sanctions on European lawmakers that froze parliamentary exchanges for years. It was only last year that those restrictions began to ease. So yes, this visit shows formal contact is reopening, but this is not a relaxed visit and it is not a trusting one. Reports say that some European lawmakers were told to bring burner phones and leave personal devices at home, measures that European lawmakers have taken for sensitive trips abroad. So the channel is reopening, but the mistrust is still very real. As for what Beijing wants, the public message is very careful. China's foreign ministry says the visit should improve European Parliament's understanding of China. It says it should strengthen exchanges and help support sound and steady China-EU ties. But in practical terms, Beijing wants more than that. It wants to show diplomatic freeze is over. It wants direct access, again, to European lawmakers, and it wants to shape debate inside the European Parliament. That matters because the European Commission may propose laws. The European Parliament are the ones that really help to amend them. So it can strengthen them or soften them. So even if the European Commission takes a hard line on China, for example, Beijing knows that the Parliament still matters, especially on trade, on industrial policy, on digital regulation. So this is not really about a sudden breakthrough. This is not a reset. It's a controlled reopening with both sides still very much wary of each other and Beijing trying to create a more stable and a more pragmatic political environment in Europe. Jill?
Interesting, but some of those issues you mentioned earlier, have they all gone away, or are there other issues that still remain a challenge to EU-China relations?
Well, there are still disputes on the table that are pretty much quite concrete. This delegation is not here to celebrate the relationship, so to speak. I mean, it is here to deal with specific complaints. First and foremost, the flood of low-cost Chinese goods into Europe, especially through online shopping platforms like Shein and Temu. The European Parliament says it is worried about the huge number of small parcels entering the EU market and whether all of them meet EU product and safety rules. The background material says that 4.6 billion small parcels entered the EU in 2024, and 91% came from China. That helps explain why this delegation is meeting Shein, Alibaba, and Temu, and why product safety, consumer protection, and fair competition are central to this trip. The second issue is overcapacity and dumping. European lawmakers worry that some Chinese industries are producing more demand than Europe can absorb, and that excess is spilling into Europe, and at prices European companies struggle to match. China says it is, but on the other hand, China can say has been trying to tackle destructive price wars at home, including among e-commerce platforms, solar panel makers, battery firms, and electrical vehicle companies. But from the EU's point of view, the real question is simple. Does this reduce unfair pressure on European market? Of course, there are also political fault lines, human rights, as we mentioned, and also Russia. Jill?
All right. Thank you so much, Yu Guan. And we heard there Yu Guan's perspective from China. But here to tell us more as well is Enza Han, joining us live from Hong Kong. Now, he is an associate professor for politics and public administration at the University of Hong Kong. And Professor, we heard from our China correspondent. What about the European perspective? Why return to China now? And how should we read this visit?
I think it means basically EU is trying to recalculate what they want to achieve from China. EU is in a very difficult position because previously that foreign policy agenda has been highly hijacked by the United States in terms of US pressure on EU variety of issues. And I think this is basically an opportunity now and then for the EU to recalibrate what they want to do with China. But I think, this European Parliament delegation to visit to China in a way that I would consider in a way that for the European counterparts, perhaps to try to get off the high horse in a way, because otherwise always, particularly for the parliamentarians in EU Parliament, they often use a very, very much a moral or value-laden kind of judgment on China. I think that kind of approach would not work.
Yeah. So you talked about Europe wanting to sort of recalibrate its relations. Well, Europe is using words like not giving in, and it also speaks of de-risking rather than coupling from China. So when you hear sentiments like that, does it suggest Europe has perhaps more at stake than China?
For me, those speeches, the audience is domestic. Audience is within EU itself, or particularly with Parliament themselves, in terms of nobody wants to show weaknesses in their way of dealing with China. This is unfortunate because the highly securitized nature of foreign relations with China when EU is concerned. As I said, because EU has been highly hijacked by American interest. That's why they cannot easily openly talk about their own interests in that sense. That's why they have to speak to their audience in that way, to try not to say, you're being weak or leave your value behind. But ultimately, I think those are empty talks. Fundamentally, it has to do with what Beijing can offer that EU has to get from China's side. And then basically, I think EU understand that is in a very difficult position because it's right now in a time when US interest is essentially trying to sideline what EU can do.
Yeah, so you talked extensively about the frictions with the US, pushing European countries somewhat towards a more accommodating stance with China. But is it enough to be a tipping point that, could produce some real change in EU policy on Beijing?
I don't think so. For me, the European Parliament is very unlikely to change. As I said, European Parliament is a very peculiar institution. So fundamentally, we will probably see more rifts within the EU decision-making bodies in terms of different member states. For example, will take more proactive, policy changes towards China. But I don't see major changes from European Parliament because these parliamentarians, they're beholden to very specific interests within the EU, and I don't think they are not necessarily related to economic ones. And that's why I personally don't see the European Parliament to make any dramatic changes.
Interesting. I'm asking with fresh EU moves to, phase out some high-risk Chinese tech, showing there's still that caution there. Can Europe truly balance cooperating in some form with China, while at the same hand maintaining this containment policy?
I don't see that's really containment. That's mostly protectionism for ineffective and weak European domestic, competitors in that sense, right? So that's why protectionism ultimately hurts itself. So which means that ultimately EU will be a loser in this economic cooperation with China. So ultimately, as I said, many conventional economists would basically say that protectionism in the end hurts yourself. That's why I don't see those kind of policies would be in any way beneficial for the European Union for the longer term.
All right, we leave it there for now, but many thanks, Professor Enzahan, Professor for Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong. Japan has deployed advanced long-range missile systems at 2 key southwestern military bases for the first time since World War II. The military has deployed the upgraded Type 12 surface-to-ship missile at Camp Kengun in Kumamoto. It has a range of about 1,000 kilometers, capable of reaching most of North Korea and parts of China's coastline, including Shanghai. Japan also deployed high-speed maneuverable weapons at Camp Fuji to defend its remote southwestern islands. Tokyo says these counter-strike capabilities are essential to deter growing regional threats. China has been stepping up military drills near Taiwan, and North Korea continues to refine its missile programs while doubling down on nuclear. Japan has long maintained a strict self-defense policy, but it has been steadily building its military, and in 2022 approved the deployment of missiles with counter-attack capabilities. Just ahead on East Asia Tonight, concerns in Asia over big tech's implementation of social media restrictions for youths. Plus,
the High North's waters are getting warmer, opening fresh opportunities for global trade. We're here in Finland with a look at the role that the country's icebreaker vessels are playing and whether the conflict in the Middle East is increasing demand and competition for Arctic shipping routes.
Some army stuff for a different...
Indonesia has summoned tech giants Meta and Google to undergo checks over non-compliance of the country's newly implemented social media curbs. The government says both firms had opposed the restrictions from the very beginning. Indonesia requires high-risk social media platforms to deactivate accounts of children under the age of 16. Failure to comply with the law could result in sanctions or even a block of the platform. The social media giants also under fire in Australia. The country is investigating Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok and YouTube for possibly failing to comply with the country's social media ban. The Australian internet regulator says tech companies are not doing enough to block users under 16. Officials say they have identified a number of poor practices, and they include allowing teenagers to bypass the blocks with ease, often by creating new accounts. The regulator adds that tech companies have not provided effective ways to report under 16s who still have access to social media. Communications Minister Nicola Wells says the tactics used to undermine the law are, quote, straight out of the big tech playbook.
The major reason that kids are going back on accounts is because social media is prompting them. The majority in some of these cases, which you'll see in the compliance update, the majority reason that children are still on social media accounts is because their particular platform hasn't even asked them their age. These companies are taking the mickey.
Australia, you'll remember, became the first country in the world to ban social media for children under 16. That move in December last year prompted other governments to consider similar steps. Indonesia is the first in Asia to ban under 16s from using platforms such as YouTube, TikTok and Facebook. Neighbouring Malaysia has passed a bill for a similar ban, saying it hopes platforms will comply with the government's decision by this year. French lawmakers as well have approved the ban, which will take effect in September. The Senate is scheduled to vote on it today. Several countries have also announced plans for a national age limit: Austria, Denmark and Spain, while the UK has launched a consultation to determine whether there should be an Australia-style ban. Some governments are stopping short of blocking access, moving to implement restrictions instead. Authorities in China have put in place a so-called minor mode program to restrict usage on apps depending on the age group. Brazil now requiring those under 16 to link their accounts to a legal guardian, while Germany and Italy are making it compulsory for children under the age of 14 to seek parental consent. In other news, warming waters and shrinking sea ice in the Arctic opening up new shipping lanes and access to vast natural resources. It sparked a race for influence in the high north, where the US, Russia and China are vying to expand their presence. But navigating these icy waters requires specialized ships known as icebreakers, and Finland is emerging as a global leader in building them. William Denslow filed this report for CNA from Helsinki.
Cutting a path through seemingly impenetrable terrain. Icebreakers boast steel thicker than merchant ships, powerful engines that ride them up on ice sheets, and crushing weight that shatters them to pieces. Their specialised purpose to clear the way for other vessels to follow.
So braking is like 1/3. Then we have friction resistance, which is the friction between the steel hull and the ice. And then we have submersion resistance, which is the resistance where you have to submerge the ice blocks under the ship.
Icebreakers have been around since the late 1800s, but today Finnish firm Railotech, formerly Aker Arctic, is at the forefront of their design. And that means adapting to an Arctic warming 3 times faster than the global average, where thinning ice makes the region more accessible, but where erratic weather also poses new navigational challenges.
You can have larger areas of open water, but you can also have, it can also mean this, that you have more storms, so that the icebreakers have to be more capable of operating in open waters and in high sea.
Railotech is just one of several Finnish companies behind Finland's dominance in the industry. Some 80% of the world's existing icebreaker vessels are designed by Finnish firms. According to experts, Finland is the only country in the world that can see all of its harbours freeze during winter. The nation's icebreaker technology was born out of necessity. But interest from other nations in these vessels has been on the rise as the race for dominance in the Arctic region heats up. In October, the US struck a deal with Finland for 11 icebreakers. The White House calls them Arctic security cutters and says they're urgently needed for national security, citing concerns over Greenland and increased Russian and Chinese activity in the high north.
There are threats. Now, Greenland is not being encircled by Russia. They're not being encircled by China. But there are threat signals, and we should be cognizant of that.
But interest in the high north goes beyond military posturing. The Arctic route has the potential to roughly halve the time taken for goods to travel from China to Europe. Finnish state-owned company Arctia operates one of the world's most experienced icebreaker fleets, helping to facilitate winter navigation for the country's merchant ships. It says warming Arctic waters open up fresh trade opportunities, and with that comes an increased need for icebreakers.
Most likely there will be more traffic in the Arctic area, and of course there will always be winter in the Arctic area, and that means that there will be formation of ice as well, and need for ice breaking if we want to use the logistical routes throughout the year.
The war in Iran and trade disruptions through the Strait of Hormuz could also have a ripple effect for the Arctic region.
Just shutting down one particular logistical chain in world trade can have tremendous impacts in terms of the world economy. So countries are looking for other ways, more reliable ways of transporting goods and services.
Major powers may be increasingly dipping their toes into Arctic trade routes, but Finland has long since taken the plunge. Around 96% of its foreign trade moves by sea, and it's their icebreakers that help keep business flowing. For CNA, I'm William Denslow in Helsinki, Finland.
Well, from the freezing waters of the Arctic, let's go next to space. Well, at least to NASA, because the U.S. Space Agency has begun the countdown to its first crewed lunar mission in more than 50 years. The Artemis II mission will blast off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida later this week, after being delayed by a hydrogen leak and valve issue.
Victor, Christina, Jeremy, we're going to the moon.
NASA is preparing to launch its first crew of astronauts toward the moon in over 50 years. The second Artemis mission will take humans deeper into space than ever before in a lunar flyby. It comes as the US races to reassert leadership in space, while facing growing competition from China. 3 US astronauts and a Canadian astronaut are due for liftoff aboard NASA's Orion capsule and Space Launch System rocket as soon as Wednesday. While swinging around the moon, Artemis II won't attempt a landing. NASA's Laurie Glaze says the 10-day mission will firstly test how the astronauts fare a record-breaking distance from home.
We have several what we call human health and performance experiments. We're going to test how they live and work inside the Orion capsule during this time. We're going to measure radiation.
And if all goes well, Orion will embark upon an ambitious lunar quest.
It's a special trajectory that when we go out to the moon's gravity is going to pull us and have us go around the moon, and then it'll sling us back towards Earth.
Humans haven't touched down on the moon's surface since Apollo 17 in 1972. It's a tricky feat NASA aims to repeat in 2028 at the lunar South Pole. Astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen are set to launch from the Kennedy Space Center. The US has a series of increasingly advanced Artemis missions extending into the next decade. It aims to set the precedent for how other countries will operate and coexist on the moon's surface, which is viewed by some as a stage of national power, where countries and companies can exploit rocky lunar resources and practice for much harder missions to Mars.
Fingers crossed, no more delays. And that's Tuesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines are available anytime. CNE.Asia, plus Facebook and YouTube if you like. Bye-bye for now.